This week on the Eldritch Lorecast, we are sailing to the Sunken Isles, the upcoming adventure module from RuneSmith in partnership with Ghostfire Gaming. All that and more right now. Hello everybody and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, your favourite Dungeons & Dragons and tabletop role-playing game podcast. My name is Ben Byrne and I am back as always with Dale Kingsmill, Sean Merwin, and special guesting this week standing in for James Hake is Logan Reese. Welcome Logan to the podcast. Dale, hello. I believe you've been having like a Twitter debate over a certain subject. You're confused. If our American guests have ever heard of, you asked the question. I don't want to steal your thunder on this.
It's very important as an opening question this week. I hope people understand the weight of this.
Very relevant too.
Yes, very important. Do you know what a sausage roll is? You're representing your nation right now.
Oh, I don't want to do that. I think... Obviously, the name implication there is that it is probably just a sausage rolled in bread, probably deep fried.
Ooh.
And I'm speaking on behalf of my nation when I add that last angle because it makes sense.
All right.
Would you?
It's a corn dog. It's just a corn dog.
Well, yeah, I don't know what a corn dog is. Like I've heard of it, but I don't know what it really is. So
I mean, it's basically a battered salve, right?
Just trash. No, it is essentially the worst combination of two types of foods that you can have. And it is inserted into like fat frying oil. So it's just the worst hot dog, like chicken, turkey, pork, and other meat added. And then you stuff that in a bunch of just cornbread, really.
As only Americans can do, too. We also put wood in it.
Yeah.
You do not.
Yeah. Well, a stick.
It's on a skewer.
We shove wood in there.
Wood shavings? Oh my goodness. Sean, please.
The wood actually tastes better than the corn dog itself.
What do you think a sausage roll is?
Sometimes it does, yeah.
I have a feeling we have something in Western New York called a calzone, which is sort of like a folded over pizza, rolled up. And I've actually had a sausage roll, at least what I've heard as a sausage roll before, which is exactly that. You take dough, sauce, like a pizza, but you roll it up as a spiral, and inside is also sausage.
Oh.
I mean, it doesn't sound dissimilar, but also the pizza sort of reroute was a bit surprising.
That's all we eat.
That's all you eat.
Dale,
Ben, please save them. Tell them what a sausage roll is.
Well, I've got a question for you. Do you consider like a spinach and feta sausage roll a sausage roll?
Well, it's not a sausage roll, but it's a spinach and feta roll.
But I would just call it, I guess so, but I just call it a sausage roll. Like if I go into a bakery, I'm like, can I have a spinach and feta sausage roll? I don't say a spinach and feta roll.
A little odd, but I wouldn't like call you out on it.
Good. I'm not going to get slammed for that.
So a sausage roll is
like a spring roll or like an egg roll?
It's so sausage meat, which in Australia is probably more likely to be sort of beef and pork than turkey or chicken. And it's sort of ground meat with lots of stuff in it, herbs and bits and bobs. When I was in high school, home ec, we made home ec. I don't think that's what it's called anymore. We made it with little bits of apple in it. But just a bit of sausage meat and then puff pastry specifically, so it gets nice and flaky. And it's I mean, more than anything, more than anything, it's a culture. It's going to the sports game on the weekend and buying one for $6, 20 cents per tomato sauce packet.
I guess in that way it kind of is like a corn dog, right? Because corn dogs are eaten at like sporting events, right?
Are they? I thought they were carnival foods.
Actually, you could kind of say that. Yeah, well, when you think carnival food, you think like funnel cake.
Yeah,
right.
I'm picturing a bunch of Australians like at picnics, like the egg roll where you have to roll the egg along the ground only with sausages. Like you have to roll it with your nose. It's a race, and you're rolling a sausage. Oh, exactly.
And it's long.
That's what
Just
it
for the
should
record,
be.
It's like these dimensions, like a rectangular food item, so we know it's not a ball.
Wait,
an easy way of explaining it.
yours
maybe,
are?
Yeah, they're like cylinder shaped. Although kind of like
Because it looks like some people segment them. Like they cut them up into like bite-sized
For
pieces.
sure. So
party
you have the
sausage roll.
party sausage rolls, or you have a sausage roll that you would eat as a meal.
yeah, party sausage roll.
This just feels like a Totino's pizza roll.
Kind
Feels
of.
like a pizza roll.
Yeah.
You're about to start a war.
I walked into when you said
Probably.
apple, that surprised me, Dale, because I walked into a bakery the other day and they
It's
had
very
sausage
fancy.
I do
rolls.
like that.
And it was filled with it looked like a McDonald's apple pie. And so maybe the easiest way of explaining it is a sausage roll is kind of like a McDonald's apple pie without the glaze and without the apple. So nothing like it whatsoever.
But meat.
That's a hot pocket.
Yeah. You
Yeah,
know what?
kind
Not
of.
dissimilar in appearance, though. You're right.
Yeah. And open on either end, sort of.
Yeah, and puff
Feels like-
pastry and savory, and probably some seeds sprinkled on top.
Anyway, welcome to our culinary and sports podcast about Dungeons and Dragons. Let's jump in. This week we've got a lot of Ghostfire news in the guise of Sunken Isles. The Sunken Isles, Logan, your current project, which you've been working on for a little while. The Sunken Isles is a source book, an adventure book that is coming out. We're doing the Kickstarter for it in February. Logan, set the stage for us. What are the Sunken Isles?
Oh boy, what aren't they? Is the worst introduction you could have. Realistically, it was a massive endeavor it's my first adventure supplement. So just going with that, there's so many shifts and so many different variables from having something that is piece by piece or having something that's just a bestiary and then going to full continuity throughout the entire book. And having to piece all these pieces together, expecting players' previous actions to result in. So it's an adventure supplement. But the basics of it is the Sunken Isles is a location created by a traveling deity that paints with its own blood. So it essentially sacrifices a part of itself to create small portions of reality, and then it puts these pieces of reality in random worlds. So this setting can be applied to your own setting or your own campaign setting or someone else's or an adventure supplement. It just gets stitched in anywhere. So canonically, it still functions that way. And it is meant to be sort of like a magical paradise where in the old days of the adventure, in the old days of the setting, people could speak to the elements. They could directly influence the world around them in kind of a harmonious way. And since time has passed, there have been massive shifts, and eventually we had settlers that came to the Isles under the guise of a king who was naturally a liar because he was a king. So he brought a lot of people there, promising them this beautiful world outside of their frozen tundra. So it's this weird clash of cultures, and the players sort of show up after history has already happened. So this king came, he settled the area, and then he had a clash with the native spirits. And that ended up with him dead, pinned to the steeple of his temple where he would sacrifice both his own people and people that were native to the Isles. And the adventure begins with there's a native spirit that is sort of the body form of one of the major islands, and it's the one that essentially did the killing blow to this character. So it's just a massive network of everything that could possibly go wrong right now at the end of a festival, and then the players just have to mop it up in this rapid it takes place. The main adventure takes place over the course of 20 weeks, with the players leveling up at the end of each week, and each week is supposed to last as long as a session, if not like 2 or 3, depending on how long the GM wants to spend in that area. And at the end of it, the party essentially gets to come face to face with this deity and be like, hey, all that stuff that we just dealt with, I think it's worth saving. And I think that'll be the most interesting internal conflict for the players, is to essentially speak to the GM and the creators of the location and explain why they want to keep playing.
Yeah, sure.
If they do.
So that's fairly rapid pace to be like level 1 to 20 within, in theory, sort of 20 sessions. Was that something that you were kind of like, wouldn't it be cool to be able to explore those higher levels, which you don't see a lot in a lot of modules?
Yeah, that is one of the starting points. Obviously, I bounce around the history and the lore there, so it's not a perfect representation of what the supplement is. But those are some of the core points that I wanted to follow throughout it is branching paths. So the party can go to one location or a different one. I think it's 2 to 3, depending on which week that you have. And the party can majorly or minorly affect the future of the Isles. So it is this branching path story that also functions as a level 1 to 20, which I think is a really interesting way to run an adventure. Even in the recent ones, they only go 1 to 10 or 5 to 8. No one ever goes all the way across the board. So that is one interesting thing I wanted to explore with the party. And a lot of the difficulty came up in making sure that these diverse locations they can visit multiple times fit the difficulty of having a level 17 player show up in a place that they were level 5 in last time and have it be interesting and engaging and challenging.
Something you were talking about before we were recording, which kind of caught my interest, which you've touched on here, is this idea that the Sunken Isles are a collection of islands, and the party really have a bit of an open choice from what you've sort of said or represented. So it's not necessarily go anywhere you want within the Isles, but any given week there's sort of a couple of paths laid out for them to be able to choose where they want to go. But the story of the Isles, the events that are happening within the campaign continue to progress even if the party don't interact directly with that thing that's happening. What sort of advice, I suppose, is in the module or have you written out? Like, is that hard to write for? Like, if the party don't go here, this happens. Is that the sort of thing that's in there?
It was definitely a mistake from the beginning to try and create an idea with that, because there's so many pitfalls that you can easily fall into, and I think we effectively avoided a lot of them. But yeah, the world lives whether or not the players are a part of it. This is one of, I think, the few stories where if the party did not exist in the adventure, everything would still happen from week 1 to 20, and there would be an outcome. So this can happen whether or not the players are involved, which makes it interesting for how they choose to go about involving themselves. You could technically run this adventure entirely in the hub base, in the hometown. You could never leave that island and still technically beat the game.
Yeah,
people would just die all over the place. But
well, I think that
you'd feel bad about it. But
what I love about campaigns that feel like they are a living, breathing world where the campaign does continue without you. I think I said before, I've probably said it before on a previous episode, but one of my gripes with Elder Scrolls games and Fallout, any Bethesda game kind of struggles with this, or at least those open world games, is that the NPCs feel very static. They kind of stand where they stand. They don't do anything unless you come and talk to them. I think maybe in Fallout there was a little bit more like when you would hit a milestone in a mission, you'd go back to some other area and it would trigger a change of circumstance in that other area because you had completed some other milestone. But it has this very static feel to it. I think that where a lot of the role play comes in for a dungeon master is not so much the moment-to-moment NPC role play, but like role playing your villains behind the scenes, because news of what the party is doing is going to get back to them. And this may or may not be relevant to the Sunken Isles specifically, but just thinking about how, again, not just the villain, but the world reacts to your party's actions, both big and small. So I think that that's a really, interesting, clever
I think there's a whole
way of
subreddit
designing.
for that. I think it's called something like long distance villain or something like that, where you get someone on the internet somewhere to just occasionally tell you what the villain is doing in your campaign.
I don't know about calling them villains, but there are a lot of opposing forces in the Isles that are not just working against the party, but are working against each other, and to some of them working against themselves. So there's a whole, there's sort of a triad of enemy groups that the party has to deal with.
That's kind of like factionalism within RPGs, or at least within a lot of D&D campaigns, right? Is this the party are almost like this chaotic element that gets dropped in, and change the natural balance that the campaign might, or the game world might have found itself in before their arrival. And now that they're there, the number of times I've played campaigns and all the NPCs are just like, who the hell are these guys? Like, they've just come in out of nowhere. They've killed 30 people on this side, 30 people on the other side. They've moved this artifact over here, and it just changes the kind of power structures within the world, and that's how the party sort of influence.
There is actually one interesting part of the Sunken Isles where the party is not the only active force trying to save the Isles and all the people on them, because we kind of wanted it to be a little bit of a bone grinder where, occasionally a player character can die. It makes sense. Everyone else is dying, so why is the party immortal? So there's a specific sort of mechanic set in place where if a party member dies, they can quickly encounter a new party member because so many of the natives and so many of the visitors, people who are vacationing here, retired and living here, are just going about trying to do what they can. So if you have a party member collapse, then while you're sailing, you could find a mostly abandoned ship that was with another group of adventurers that were trying to do something that you don't know about, and the only survivor is the next party member. And there's a minor mechanical penalty set in where if you die during a week, your character that you introduce that week does not get the level that everyone else does.
Sure.
So it becomes a lot more difficult if you are very prone to dying.
There's a lot of content included in the adventure as well, though, to help what you're saying in terms of the party can be from outside of the Isles. They can be adventurers kind of coming in and exploring them, but there's new player races, there's new backgrounds to help sink them into the world or kind of stitch them into the campaign world, feel like they're a natural part of it rather than purely intruders into it. There's quite a few too. Do you want to talk about some of the, legitimate question, talk about some of the new races that are in there?
No, that's what you should say.
No.
Yeah, I'm good.
They're secret.
Let's talk about sausage rolls some more.
Yeah, back to sausage rolls. No, we have. They're not necessarily new races or new groups of people. They are very much fabricated cultures that we created specifically for this setting. They're not based on anything. I hope people don't get that perspective, but. We have the Icolf, who are the settlers, and they are a race of dwarves that come from a much more frostbitten setting. They came on all these long ships based on one adventurer's accidental sighting of the location. He went back to the kingdom that they're from, said, "Hey, I found something," and he mysteriously vanished. And now we have this king bringing all of his people here who are amazing at not just stonework, but woodwork, and they live where they come from is very restricted in resources. So to show up in a location that is just rich with countless resources, they are naturally unfamiliar with that type of environment. So they start collecting, they start stockpiling, and that is what causes one of the major problems. And as history goes, if eventually their leader is revealed to be the monster that he is, and they start to integrate, they start to understand and respect the native culture there more, and now they have a major hub area that is a combination of both cultures. And that is what the festival at the beginning of the adventures is celebrating, is this merging of two of the major quote-unquote races. The other ones that are native, they are humanoid, and they essentially are... Originally, they were very nomadic. They liked to just roam around the Isles as much as they could, never setting their roots anywhere. So there's a lot that comes with that playable race of the native people to the Sunken Isles, or the Isles of Manaki, as they're called. And then we have three interesting, much more monstrous races. I guess the most prominent of which would be the Kiai, and they are sort of like oceanic defenders. They're similar to Tritons, but bearable. They're not annoying, abrasive people. They are very respectful of their environment. They have intentionally isolated themselves under the ocean, and they have built their culture against the face of a reef. And most of what they spend their time doing now that the local cultures are trading and they're starting to get resources from outside areas, they're finding that pirates, sunken ships, bad directions are littering the ocean. So that is their first problem, is dealing with just the side effects of industrialization of the area. So they're trying to figure out how to at least slow down this problem. And a lot of them are finally coming out of the ocean. They're going to the islanders and saying, hey, can we work together? Because this is not the environment that we're familiar with. It is shifting. It's uncomfortable. And that's one of the major ones that I think the players will be interested in. Another one, and the most monstrous, it has two subraces. They are called the Decapodians, and they are just lobster people. So we have a group called, I couldn't pronounce it properly, but they are much more closely related to the concept of lobsters, where they have these huge chitinous bodies, and every year they shed their shells, which actually has an in-game mechanical function where when they do that, their AC drops and their speed drops. And if you're playing one of them, you have to deal with it during a certain week of the game. And lobsters, they don't age. They just grow effectively. So like disease can kill them, and poaching or just killing them can kill them. But if they're left to their own devices, essentially they get much larger and they can live relatively forever. So we have this one Decapodian called Old Shell, who is just this gigantic, monstrous lobster who is like the father of this whole culture. And he is a relative, I guess, patriarch. He's this old guy who sits in his own room and just talks to people because he has nothing else to do. So they're definitely a very interesting race. And then next to them, we have the Manti, which are based on mantis shrimp. They are another one of the sub-races, and they're physiologically very, very different. They have these, ridiculous mantis shrimp eyes that can see a crazy number of things. They have auxiliary appendages that they can use to punch like lightning. So if you want to be a brutal character, I feel like the Manti would be very, very interesting to go along with that.
When you say brutal character, does that reflect the sort of culture that they like? I guess, like, as you describe these anatomies, it makes me go, like, how has their culture evolved to kind of reflect their anatomy? Like what natural to them, what is natural to them that has evolved culturally? Does that make sense?
I think so. Definitely a large part of their culture, firstly, is that they only work in pairs. So there is essentially a striker and a bruiser, and they sort of work as a very, very confident duo with each other. So players who pick one of them will find themselves confused and immediately attaching to another one of the party members, regardless of who or what they are. So I think that'd be fun for the dynamics. But with their physiology, a lot of it is it comes from their secondary appendages, their large, like massive claws that they use in essentially just tests of strength in basic contests where they will fight with each other. So these things have massive, just ridiculous muscle mass. I believe they're large creatures. And then they have the smaller appendages that help them with basic day-to-day tasks. If we got the chance to explore them further, I definitely would have wanted like a small fry or a shrimp race as another sub-race. Just some tiny little actual shrimp guys, little bottom feeders, but didn't get to explore that.
Gnomes.
And gnome shrimp. That would be really fun.
So I have a question in terms of product design and adventure design. So how easy will it be for players to play a character that's from the Sunken Isles and absorb the background, absorb the things that they would know as that character, even though it's so different from a core D&D game?
Well, with these specific races, instead of having like races and backgrounds separate, which we still do, we thought it would be interesting to add like personality traits and tropes and ideals, not just to the background, but to the type of character that you want to play. So hopefully they give good guidance to the players. Obviously, we want to encourage diversity. Players can do whatever they want because it's their game. But I think we have a lot of resources in just the description of each of the races and then the specific locations that these races are from. So there's a lot of details and history when it comes to where these people are from. And that kind of feeds into the last race, which are called the Meyer scales. They ended up being designed very similar to kobolds, but they are actually a humanoid dinosaur race that happened entirely by accident. So a lot earlier in the history of the Isles that isn't actively recorded, and only some Meyer scales know about this, there were not pirates, but poachers that came to a small sect of the Sunken Isles called the Primal Archipelago, a place untouched by time that has smaller segmented islands with dinosaurs all over the place. They showed up in the area, they found one of the most dangerous creatures, and stole eggs from its nest. And as they were escaping, they crossed over something called the entropy or the entropic abyss, and dealt with some metaphysical storm. So they were pulled into this abyss, and their physiology was essentially merged with the creatures that they had stolen from the island. So these tiny creatures in cages, all these eggs, and all these pirates are mixed together, and they become this kind of diminutive race of dinosaur people that get washed up on just a bog of an island, mostly just sunken, deeply soaked because it gets hit by tsunamis like twice every year. So it's very difficult for them to build up what they have. They're very good at hiding in the mud and waiting it out. But their full culture has completely evolved from an accidental group of maybe 30 people.
There's definitely a lot of like thought and color and difference kind of between each of the races, which I love. Like they're not, overly similar. And as well, when I was talking about the physiology before, like obviously with the dinosaur people, there's a lot like, I'm just complimenting the world building, I suppose. Like there's a lot of thought that's how their culture has evolved because they've washed ashore on this muddy bog.
We didn't explicitly state how they would interact because we want the players to and the GM to kind of organically come up with that. But historically, especially with the oceanic defenders, the people who live below the surface world, they're very intentionally isolated. Their culture is very specific, and they're not comfortable with outsiders changing it or affecting it or educating them in new ways that they're not familiar with. So as the adventure starts, there's sort of a realization that happens where since the world is more or less ending, they're realizing that they need to do whatever they can. They need help from whoever can help them, and it's a massive learning process for them starting now. So previously, they were very isolated and very comfortable with that.
New races, new backgrounds, new magic items, the sort of things that you would find in an adventure module. The thing that caught my eye was, and this bounces around online a lot, but naval rules. But more specifically, not necessarily the naval combat, but the sort of, you get your ship, you can upgrade your ship, you can customize your ship. If you choose to, you can sort of own your own vessel, which I love the idea of the party almost having their own, like a party lair or a fortress or something like that, but it's a mobile ship that they can customize and move around the islands. Was that something you knew you wanted to put in there?
It's the major aspect of the game that gets people from one location to another. So if the GM, say, wants to have a whole entire session just out on the water, I wanted them to be able to do that and to have it be interesting. Ghosts of Saltmarsh has a very interesting and very functional way that the ships kind of function. That's an overlap, but I wanted to kind of simplify that. I wanted to make it very easy for players to just pick a ship and go, and then have things out of their control start happening to them, as opposed to a lot of excessive and forced hands-on with like how we run this. So instead of expertise and people being like where they need to be, knowing what they need to know, it's just a few different things. The way that the boat works in combat is actually much closer to a layer than an actual entity. So around Initiative Mark 20, the party, if they're in their stations, can do one or two things, and then combat continues. So it's not restrictive or isolated to, I have to be here, do this. I can't cast any spells. I can't do anything. We want the players to keep playing their characters, but, still have an effect on the ship.
Which can I say? So when Theros came out, I was a little bit disappointed that when it comes to because so much of Greek mythology is island hopping, right? It's this archipelago.
Absolutely,
to get from one point to another, you have to go by boat, and it's such a significant thing in these stories. But you look at the Theros map, and it's mostly land, and you're gonna go by land, not by boat. And then when they say if you want to have boat stuff, I guess go by, Ghost of Saltmarsh and just do that. I was so disappointed. So this, getting island hopping, but like with boat attention. Mwah.
One of the major issues that I found as a player with the boats is that every part of them is segmented, which is a cool concept. I appreciate that there's that much complexity, but nothing else has that. There is no other gargantuan monster where, this is its foot damage, this is its, tail damage. So I wanted to kind of shave off the fat that pushes players away from exploring the boats. So I think one of the minor pitfalls is that I'd like to have more uniquely named boats in the book that we just did not get time to do. So there's a few nods, like there's a nod to the One Piece boat, and then there's a nod to real life Blackbeard.
Am I correct in saying that the boats basically have their stat block, like that's how they function, rather than being like this massive kind of multifaceted thing like you were saying?
Yeah, it's almost simplified down to the concept of like a Magic the Gathering vehicle where you need this number of people and then it moves. And then you can naturally have specialists, and there's a massive amount of NPCs that know very specific things about different boats. Like one of the first people you find is a captain that has covered himself in the corpses of these things that were hunting him, and he's just unconscious because he's been there too long.
Sure.
Ew.
Yeah. He's resourceful. That's his whole character arc. He knows what to do to stay alive.
I am the voice of the people.
I hope I never get that resourceful.
Yeah.
One of the major things with specific to this world setting, it is that it is very high magic. It's not just standard high magic, where when you're sailing, the ocean can come alive and try to attack you, or stars can literally coalesce and fall from the sky and hit your ship. Like, there's a lot of nonsense that can happen, and we made a really cool table for very unique events that can happen out to sea.
Sean, have you run a lot of nautical adventures? Are there some mainstays that you think nautical adventures really need?
I think there are several ways. I think there are several ways to handle it. And, it is a problem. It can be a problem when you do try to do too much. When you try to make ship-to-ship combat. And as Logan said, when you try to make the characters use their actions to run the ship, they can't do anything else. And there is no mechanic as it sits in the game that, you could say, well, they can use their bonus action. Well, some classes rely on their bonus action way too much to be a useful character, that even asking them to do that is a lot. So I prefer, when I do run these nautical adventures, to let the characters be themselves and have a crew that handles that. And maybe the characters can play the part of the crew. Also, everyone you play the captain as well as your character. You play the lookout as well. And that's a way to do it. But for the most part, I generally prefer to just let the characters deal with their actions in a new setting. There's a risk of drowning. There's a risk of the monster being able to swim away and then come back, unless they find a way to stop that. So to make new challenges within the nautical setting, rather than trying to do anything too fancy within the setting itself.
Somehow, as you were describing the crew, it became the crew from Muppet Treasure Island in my head. Excellent.
Always. Yeah.
Sweetums, hold the rigging.
I think that's what my players often imagine as well. The thing I have to remind players of whenever there's a nautical encounter, whether it's a sea monster or a boat of pirates that kind of, pull up again alongside them or something like that, is that the crew is there, they are controlling the boat, and the, rival crew is bigger than the 7 or 8 pirates that I'm going to put down. but it's happening kind of in the background of the scene, but the camera is focusing on what you guys are doing because you're the main characters of the adventure.
Yeah.
So I think I agree. Keeping it simple is definitely better. But the number of times I've had party members go, well, if only the crew would help us fight this thing, it would make it all so much easier. I'm like, they're there. I don't want to roll, 27 attack rolls every round.
They're fighting the out-of-focus pirates in the background.
Yeah.
A lot of the crew that the party can get in Sunken Isles are they're all NPCs and they have personalities. They have reasons that they're there with the party. So I think you could just kind of generally describe what this strange motley crew of people that are helping you are doing.
Sunken Isles is going to be a Kickstarter in February, start of February. I don't want to put a specific date on the launch myself yet, but definitely look for it in February. Unless, Logan, you know off the top of your head, although...
No, I know it's next month.
One of the great aspects of Sunken Isles, as we were talking about, was kind of stitching the characters into the world of the setting. They can choose their race from the Sunken Isles itself. And when I was reading through the source book, through the manuscript that we've got at the moment, it just reminded me of player backgrounds as something that I think are a really great addition to the game. Understanding, like, I've never played anything earlier than 5th edition, but understanding that character backgrounds were a new thing that was added in 5th edition, but also... beyond just the pure, like, background mechanics are generally pretty soft, right? Like, they're not designed to give the character a massive mechanical boost.
Narrative.
But even beyond that, exactly, like, what is the narrative kind of background of your character? I just wanted to kind of dive into that and how you guys, especially when you're starting new campaigns, how important are backgrounds when you're, doing a one-shot or something like that compared to just starting a new campaign with the Session Zero. Sean, as someone who has seen previous editions before 5th, what do backgrounds kind of like? What does the mechanical adds that they give, the prompts that they give the players really add to the characters?
They're a strange thing in the sense that they really bridge two worlds. They bridge the narrative and they bridge the mechanical, which is something that we really hadn't seen too much before that in D&D, at least previous editions.
Sure.
Because we don't think of them as big mechanical things, but they give a couple of skills. They give tool proficiencies. They give equipment, starting equipment. So when you're designing them, they really are useful in creating that bridge between two worlds, role-playing and game mechanics, that are sometimes seen by players as totally separate. And so there is a lot to... They're one of the things that if I'm like testing a new designer to see what their chops are, I'll be like, create a background. And it's interesting to see if they try to do too much with them, because they're not meant to do a lot mechanically, but they're meant to do something important mechanically. And there's a difference there between those two concepts. And so you don't want them to be too specific, because they are meant to be general backgrounds. And as soon as you start to make them too specific, they creep over into the world of the story going forward, because this is what you used to be. It's not what you are now as an adventurer.
They're like full of hooks for making your character. They're not really like a template. It's more of an inspiration, like a jumping off point.
Anto from Icarus Games has a really, really good video about making your own backgrounds, like homebrewing. I think the intent with his video was specifically for people who want to write and publish their own homebrew content. It was like, here's a guide on making backgrounds, but it's just a really solid little thing that sort of breaks down the really delicate art of like underplaying backgrounds rather than overplaying backgrounds. I think he does a really good job. So anyone who's interested, check that out. I actually, when I have such a clear memory of being someone who had never played 5th edition, never played Dungeons and Dragons, actually. I was into Pathfinder and stuff at the time, and I was staying in LA at my friend Becca's house, and I was alone in her apartment for the day, and there was a D&D book out, and I was like, kind of had to just have a little peek, and I was flipping through, I saw the backgrounds. I was like mad about them in a weird and self-centered way. I was like, this is very limiting for people who are coming up with backstories for their character. It's bizarre looking back now, because at the time I was so, the way that I created characters was very, I'll come up with this whole story for them. But I didn't really give it the room. I didn't acknowledge that this was a game designed looking at new players. Players who are stressed out about trying to come up with a whole background. It's like, here's just a bunch of them. I was like, if you give them a list, they'll only choose from the list. But like, it's great to have a list that says, hey, have you considered that maybe your character was a sailor? I don't know. I have some little nitpicks about the way that the backgrounds are implemented. I think partly because we're talking about this balancing, right, of a bit of a mechanical boost, but really what it is it gives you space for role play elements. I think those are my favorite ones, right? They'll give you a background feature that will say, hey, here's an opportunity. Someone, you have a criminal contact, right? That's a great little feature that doesn't give you too much mechanical power, but it does give you a role play hook that can be powerful.
The general functionality of them is not that they're supposed to help you write your backstory, is that they're supposed to sort of translate whatever backstory you want to make into what's about to happen. Because D&D is about creating a story, not so much as writing one down or telling it to your players. It's creating it as you go, and I think that's a really good way that these backgrounds have been implemented currently.
Oh, we talk about background, we talk about backstory, and so many people conflate the two when we definitely should not be conflating them.
Totally. And I mean, I completely had to shift my perspective to look at things like, look at the skill proficiencies and say, this is just a little flag that you can say, yeah, I'm good at athletics and here's why. It's not meant to be something big. It's just like, hey, here's a small explanation about the person that you were, which I think is really, really handy. The ones that still bug me, I am still bugged by a lot of the ones in the Player's Handbook, because there'll be things like, if you're part of the Artisans Guild, then when you die, they might pay for the funeral. And I'm like, that will never come up. I guarantee you that is not a roleplay opportunity. That will never come up. No one whose character has just died, the party is not worrying about paying for the funeral. That's not a thing. No. Give me something good.
Yeah. Another important reason for keeping those backgrounds that you create general is that they're great tools for adventure writers or GMs, DMs to write for a type of character without being able to write for a specific character. Right? If you are an adventure writer and you're going to publish something, you don't know who's going to be playing it. So you can't say, well, Georgiana the dwarf wants to go on this adventure blank. But you can say anyone with the artisan's background would be interested in this adventure because there's an artisan involved in some way, or a criminal comes at it from this direction. And that is a very useful tool for adventure designers. Or if you're creating your own adventure, say in the Sunken Isles, you can create backgrounds that hook directly into the story.
They're very much meant as starting points. And like I said, one of the major things is when you have players dying left and right, hopefully in the adventure, these backgrounds are still relevant. They're not like, oh, this is just the beginning of the adventure and now these backgrounds don't work anymore. Like there's someone who gets shipwrecked. It is more likely that you get shipwrecked as the adventure goes on as opposed to the beginning, so that the backgrounds still, it's good to have backgrounds that make sense no matter where the character is coming from. Not just like, oh, these people would show up at a tavern. It's anywhere. And also just another point on that is that when you have a background, it's not necessarily something that is completely done, like it's over. When you get introduced to a story, you can still be a soldier. You can be a sage right at that point and then stop doing it then. So it's your background in relation to the adventure, not to your character. This
is a niche reference, but it kind of reminds me of in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, season 2, the episode Halloween. Xander is wearing a soldier costume and they all get turned into their costume, so he becomes a soldier for the night. But throughout the next couple of seasons, he still just kind of remembers some soldier stuff. And it just comes up every now and then. It's not like he is being a soldier every single day. He's just like, no, I mean, when it's relevant, I know stuff. That's how I like backgrounds to be.
One of my favorite backgrounds was in the Acquisitions Incorporated book. We created the background of like child of a celebrity.
I love it so much.
Just like how awful your life is because your parent is a celebrity adventurer. Good. And everyone expects things from you, but your life is horrible. But here are the few good things that came out of that. Right? You can name drop, and you might have a potion of healing that you stole. So it was so fun to be that little weird background.
Okay, so has everyone here made their own backgrounds for different things? What's your favorite background you've ever made for a player or for yourself or for a published thing?
The ones that I have created have generally been like I was running a homebrew campaign in my own world for a very long time, and so started to create backgrounds that were specific to that world, and they were fairly they were kind of riffs on some of the backgrounds that already existed rather than being something that was built from scratch. So instead of the acolyte, I think is sort of the religious one, it was like you are a keeper of the evergreen garden. So you actually have nature as a skill because you're almost druidic in your beliefs, even though you're quite religious as a character. I find what I was going to say with backgrounds, and it was interesting what you said before, Sean, about keeping backgrounds and backstories separate, or at least defining those two things in this conversation, because I wanted to talk about backstories as well. But in terms of the backgrounds, I'm almost at a point where I feel like you could just tell a character, all right, instead of choosing a background, pick two proficiencies, tell me why you're good at those proficiencies as part of your character's backstory, so justify them. And we'll come up with a feature together that makes sense for the campaign that will actually be useful for you, that also makes sense as part of that backstory. Because as it stands at the moment, I don't use any of the tables for suggested bonds, flaws, personality traits, or ideals. I just tell my players, you can just make it up. You use the chart if you want suggestions, if you feel like you need that prompt, but I feel like I'm like taking away a little bit of what was designed and put in the book a little bit at a time until I'm almost to the point where we're just making up backgrounds kind of wholesale for individual characters. Which I thought you'd like, Dale, based on what you said earlier.
I think backgrounds are a great idea. I don't love how they're implemented in book. But of course, how could you implement them any other way? So like, I mean, well, no, you could. I mean, I have ideas for that actually. But, it's different.
What backgrounds do, especially for new players, is they're sort of a microcosm of the game itself. There's a structure, and you have to follow the structure. But within that structure, you have lots of role-playing options. So even if you are the folk hero, you can be all different sorts of things within that folk hero template. And you can choose your bond and you can choose your flaw, but you do have these things that come with it. And it's a gentle way, at least I've found, to introduce this concept to people who have no idea what a role-playing game is.
Yeah, it's very much like a tutorial for being creative. It's, okay, here is this. It is entirely yours. How much do you want to change it? And then that definitely goes forward into how players act in the game. Going back to your question, I think, because this book is the first one that I've made actual backgrounds for. I made a bunch of classes and subclasses, but one of the more interesting ones, or probably the most out of like the 4 or 5, is a retired adventurer. So it fits a lot more for older characters who, instead of having all these like, I was a soldier, I was a lord, it's I was exactly what I'm about to be again, reluctantly. And so you get to answer these questions for your character, like, why did I stop adventuring? Like, what happened? What did I learn while I was doing it? And how does that move forward when all these youngsters are telling me I have to get out of my chair again?
What about you, Sean? What were some of your favorites?
That is my background. I feel like, why are you young people making me get out of my chair?
All right.
But
we're putting you
what
in
was the
your
question?
What's your favorite background that you've designed?
It has to. Yeah, I think it goes back to that Acquisitions Incorporated book. We also made the plaintiff. The plaintiff, you were suing Acquisitions Incorporated for something horrible that they did to you, and it got to be such a drag that finally you settled out of court. And one of the things that Acquisitions Incorporated offers you is the chance to become a franchisee of Acquisitions Incorporated. So, that's your background. It was so fun because they fit the mold, but they're just so out there, fitting into that world that it was hilarious to work on.
Like, oh, you're a hermit? I am a legal problem.
Yes. Exactly.
Not quite the same thing, but I had a tiefling bard in one of my campaigns who played a lawyer. And instead of a spell casting focus being an instrument, it was basically almost like Yondu's arrow from Guardians of the Galaxy, but it was a pen. And so when he would cast spells, he would basically like write in the air, and the ink would flow from the pen and then catch fire, and the spell was cast. And I feel he was from one of my first campaigns. I have no idea what background he chose, but I feel like a unique lawyer background with like expertise in deception and persuasion would have fitted that just right.
Oh, yeah.
But then transitioning into a conversation about backstories and how much importance those can and should have on the campaign, how much investment players give them. Some of the best advice I think I was given by my brother who introduced me to Dungeons & Dragons was that nothing you put in your backstory should be more interesting than the campaign you're about to play. Because why wouldn't we tell that story instead? And I've definitely had players that kind of they're level 1 and they come in and they're like, I am an ex-lord who single-handedly led a charge against hordes of undead, and then I was crowned, but now I am banished and have been fighting goblin tribes, and it just kind of goes on and on and on from there. Are there similar rules of thumb that you think are useful for players, even if they're, not necessarily brand new players, but maybe they're starting to get to the point where they feel more comfortable creating their own character backstories? Are there approaches that you have for that?
I will say that I'm getting real close to employing a house rule that when you're writing a character backstory, you have a limit. I don't know what the limit is, like 5, I don't know, a limit of 5 NPCs that you can introduce me to. Just one too many times where I get like a laundry list of 20 people. I don't remember any of them. I don't know who they are. Sometimes the player will be like, just like Joe Bob, right? And I'm like, I don't know who that is. I can't possibly remember. So that's probably where I'm at. Just try, keep it simple. Less is more.
There's a really interesting sort of mechanical function that it's not something that we made up at our table, but it's something that we use. I forget who came up with it, but it's called a system of daggers, essentially. And you are allowed like 3 to 5 daggers. And these are things that you put in your backstory that can negatively affect you during the adventure as it goes.
That the DM can stab you with, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
I've heard this.
Yeah, so you're supposed to hand them over to the DM. I definitely think that complexity can become a problem, but it also stems from the player's passion for the character or for the setting. So there's a difference between a transcription of your character and a communication. If you want to write up everything that's happened to you, that's fine. Don't expect anything more than that. That you did that for yourself. But if you are creating a character that you need to communicate to the GM, have just like 1 to 10 at most, like bullet points, paragraphs at most, just saying like, hey, these are the things, not that I've done, but things that I think would affect the story going forward.
See, that's way more useful advice than what I said.
I think that's good because taking a little bit of what you both said, I've totally been in that situation, Dale, where even like 3 or 4 NPCs that are introduced as part of a character backstory times 3 to 6 to 7 players at the table, all introducing this cast of supporting characters, becomes exhausting to be able to juggle all of those in your head, and especially when
after
players
you've already written your whole campaign.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a balancing act there, and it's why I really respect Session Zeros to come in and have a dialogue about the story that you're going to tell together. Not that the GM wants to give the whole thing away or anything like that, but it becomes a juggling act when you have 5 disparate characters that want their backstories to tie back into the campaign, but they have nothing to do with each other. And so it's like, oh, how can I stitch this NPC into this part of the campaign? And I think I see an opportunity to do it here, but it's going to be a little bit weird. And so having that Session Zero where the players can kind of talk to each other, and I think I've talked about it before, like using Fiasco's relationship system to try to build relationships between the player characters so that their backstories actually do bleed into each other, and it makes bringing those into the campaign easier on the GM, but also possibly more rewarding for the players because they're like more than one player is invested in anything that's happening at any one time.
And because the other thing is, like, I don't think, or certainly I as a player never expect every aspect of my character backstory to come up in play. I don't think it all needs to tie in, but it can be really hard when someone hands you a backstory that you can't find a way to tie any of it in, you know?
That hurts.
So yeah, that
it's
Session
painful.
Zero communication is just really, key for satisfaction on all sides.
How do
And
you usually handle
some of
this?
that comes from like pre-preparation, where you have to make sure not to get the party's expectations or anticipations up. It's like when you tell them to build a character, you have to make sure that they know the confines, but also not to put too many of them, so that it's, I don't even get to make my character, I just throw stuff into your world. It's a balancing act, absolutely.
For sure. I like what you said before in terms of, if you're going to write 7 pages for your character backstory, the GM is not obliged to read through all of that for every person any more than the players are obliged to like care about every single detail of the GM's world. Sean, do you have a different approach to this or similar approach?
Not really. If I sit down with you at a table, I want you to tell me your backstory in like 2 minutes or less.
Yeah.
And and if you can get something really interesting to me in 2 minutes or less, then I will add that to the campaign.
Sure.
And during that Session Zero, to sum up what has already been said, when you sit down at that Session Zero and people have a backstory that they want to include, an NPC, well, my brother is blah, blah, blah. Just your NPC and his NPC or your PC and his PC are brothers. Make it work. There, now you have now you have a living backstory.
Now you have a brother.
Yeah. And if I can get all the characters to have their own backstory all interconnect, then we're living the backstory every session without me having to add anything to it, because these 5 barbarian half-orc brothers who are playing this adventure are role-playing about how their mother treated them and how how it comes. It reminds them when the beholder attacks them that, oh, this is how mom used to treat us, right? They can play all that out amongst themselves, and I can just sit back and enjoy it, as opposed to having to push it forward through my own work. And as little work as you can make your GM do, the more your GM will appreciate it.
Yeah, and I mean, the other hope of these kinds of limitations is that they will foster that communication that Logan was talking about, right? Because if you say you've got, 500 words, go, then that person has to suddenly pick what is most interesting from their ideas and what is most important to them from their ideas, right? So suddenly they go, oh, what's more important? This, side story about being a sailor, or this side story about being a soldier. Oh, I like the soldier stuff more. Okay, let's talk about that. I mean, that was a terrible example, but giving them limitations, the idea is just, squeeze out just the juice, cut the pulp.
And as a GM, be open to the players saying, when you introduce the shopkeeper, have the player be comfortable enough to say, can this shopkeeper be this person I talked about in my backstory? And as the GM, let that happen. Let it go. Even if you had a really cool idea for this shopkeeper, give them that. And that invites a richer, deeper story for all involved.
Because then it's not just the GM telling the story to the party, it's also the party sharing in the story. And I think a huge part of being a GM is just battling expectations. It's making sure that whatever happens is not way less than the party is expecting, but also doesn't just destroy any feasible reality or any realistic story that you want to tell.
Yeah, there's the mean kind of joke online about the warehouse. And the player going, is that a person that turns into a house? And the GM's like, yes, it is. Like, absolutely. That's way better than what I had. And that's a bit of a ridiculous example. Yeah, but exactly that. Like, I've done that before where I had this wizard character who the party had to go to for aid, and I had it in my head that they were going to be this really Merlin, Gandalf-style wizard with long, wispy hair. And the players had met another spellcaster earlier in the campaign. And as it was building up to meeting this impressive Gandalf-like figure, they were like, oh, I think we know who this wizard is. This is the guy we met earlier. And I was like, yep, it is. Like, just cross out whatever I had this other character show up instead, because you want to reward the players, make them feel like they've engaged with the story and figured something out as well, So I am wholeheartedly agreeing. Let's wrap a bow on this episode. One quick question that we've had on YouTube came from Vrice. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly with the username. They asked this question after we did our actual play of Fate over the Christmas period. Very much enjoyed the game. And wanted to ask if we use virtual tabletops. If we do use virtual tabletops, which one we use, what do we recommend, what have we enjoyed using in the past? And I love the second part of their question. If not, what would you use if you were forced to use one? So under duress of death, exactly. Red laser dot moving up the side of your head.
Yeah.
Dale, do you use virtual tabletops? Have you played with GMs that use them?
I don't tend to use virtual tabletops, but I, by necessity, have played on virtual tabletops because I'm in Australia. So that just happens. But I have used, I think, Roll20, D&D Beyond, which kind of counts. And of course, I'm currently playing in a Colville game that is using Fantasy Grounds. I'm really enjoying Fantasy Grounds, actually.
What about it?
Well, once you figure out the sort of hotkeys, not hotkeys really, but it's a little bit of a learning curve to figure out how it does things. But once you figure out how it does things, it does everything. It really is. I mean, for the games that it supports, it does everything.
I love Theater of the Mind, which is not a virtual tabletop. Okay. It's just playing by description. But
it's a kind of virtual tabletop.
It depends on your definition of virtual, but I guess. I really like D&D Beyond. It is a fantastic resource for what it is, and it follows the basic rules of web design, where if it's more than 3 clicks or less, I'm not going there.
Sure.
It does that very well. It's very understandable, and that's kind of the problem that I have with Fantasy Grounds is the truth about starting anything new is that starting it is the hardest thing to do. Yeah. Fantasy Grounds feels so inaccessible if you don't have the patience to get over that first hump. So I think if at gunpoint, I would probably go with Roll20 just because it's a little bit easier.
I find Roll20 super confusing because I don't understand the commands.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Whereas at least Fantasy Grounds is like click things. Anything where I have to type my commands, I start to get confused very quickly. But also, I mean, you're probably right about Fantasy Grounds.
But I would prefer, if I had to choose and if I had the patience, I would support Fantasy Grounds instead.
Fair. Yeah, I agree with Dale. Clicking is definitely more my brain. Sean, what about you?
Mm-hmm.
I put off doing a virtual tabletop game for as long as I could until the certain pandemic hit. I'm not going to name which pandemic, but it wasn't the Spanish flu.
Black Plague.
And I took the time finally to learn Roll20, and it took me a good 10 hours just sitting there going through tutorials, and it was a struggle the whole way. And once I came out the other side, it was usable. I wouldn't say it's enjoyable, but it's usable. And I prefer theater of the mind as well. But the players who I were dealing with were very much tactical folks who cannot play theater of the mind without me hearing about it. The whining was brutal.
You asked a bunch of GMs, which is just the wrong crowd to ask that question.
Yeah, exactly. But I've also heard that there's something called Owlbear Rodeo.
Yeah.
I haven't heard of that one.
Supposed to be a much simpler, it doesn't have all the bells and whistles, right? It won't run your game for you like Fantasy Grounds or Roll20 can if you take the time to set it up. But if you just want to move things around a map, I've heard the Owlbear Rodeo is very easy to learn, very easy to use, and will give you that sort of tactical overview that you might need without having to go through a steep learning curve.
Okay, that's
I
interesting.
changed my answer.
So Roll20 is great because it's got all this support in terms of tutorials. Fantasy Grounds has some nice depth to it. We've got Owlbear Rodeo, which sounds like new kid on the block, very cool. I think as well, D&D Beyond, once it really gets a proper, because they're planning on doing a virtual tabletop, right? That's what it feels like, at least. I think
definitely
they're a real player possibly because I think that their key really is simplicity, get people playing and get people playing now. So it'll be interesting to see how they shuffle in compared to all the other virtual tabletops.
Yeah, for sure. I've never used it, but I've heard the same about Owlbear Rodeo. A lot of the DMs that I work with have started using it for its simplicity. And I was the same as you, Sean, in terms of was putting off playing online, knew that it was a space that people really enjoyed.
We're all such bah humbugs.
I reckon. But it was, I suspect, I don't know for sure, but I suspect the same pandemic that forced me to finally check out what it was like playing online. The one that I settled on, because I differ, I feel, from at least Logan and Sean, if not you as well, Dale, in terms of I'm a war gamer before I'm a role player. And so I play, I love miniatures. I love the tabletop. I love the tactical view. I love painting minis and then putting them on the tabletop for in-person games. And so my sort of transition for that for online was getting beautiful artworks that all the Patreons that people have online for these battle maps now, and using Fog of War tools and using all this different stuff to make this really detailed, lived-in looking environment for the players to play in. The software I was using is called Arkenforge, which is much closer to a sort of Fantasy Grounds. It'll run your campaign. It has Fog of War. It has a sort of directory where you can put your campaign notes into it. It has music as well that you can use to play during your campaign. It has sound effects. It'll make you coffee. It will also walk your dog if you need it to. So it's a really good all-in-one platform. It can be, I think, a little bit complicated to use. So Owlbear Rodeo is maybe I just want a battle mat and that's all I need it to do. I think
another,
what I've heard is
just
recommended.
An honorable mention, World Anvil, an old sponsor of mine. They definitely have a really interesting site that has a lot of resources for tabletop gaming that other platforms don't really explore very much. So I think it's an interesting side project to check out.
I also should have mentioned Tailspire, which is really, in terms of virtual tabletops, it's really gone, what if we could make D&D look like the video game in your brain for a lot of new people, which, it's like super like pretty graphics. It's all kind of at this angle. So you get the effect of like an isometric map without the confusion of an isometric map. And it's kind of all modular and you can piece it together, which is very, very cool. But I'm sure eats a ton of processing space. Like it would be a lot to run, but very cool to run. Arkenforge is kind of the same. Like I purchased the computer I'm on this call on basically to run it. Not that it needed to be super beefy, but it just needed to be a step up from a Mac. And
for better or worse, the thing that I found about running games online was that it changed the way as a DM I planned games where, if I have a dungeon, a combat can happen anywhere in that dungeon. In theory, when I'm playing in person, it's like, combat started. All right, let me get out my wet erase mat and here's the walls and here's these objects and let's put our minis on and away we go. Whereas playing virtually online, I couldn't help myself. I found myself just spending so much time constructing the whole dungeon because I wanted to have it all there in case a combat spilled out into a corridor or a combat, started in an unexpected place, or I wanted to have a random encounter. And so what I would find myself doing is playing it almost more like a video game where I've got the players' tokens and I'm dragging them through the dungeon, through the fog of war, and then hiding bits of artwork, magic items, like literally on the map, and forcing the players to do perception checks instead of their characters, where they'd be like, is that something on the map that I can see? And I'd be like, yes, it is. You have discovered, whatever it is. Or there's a hole in the wall. Let me put a statue over that hole and turn on the fog of war so the party can't see through the statue. So they assume that it's just a wall behind it. But when I make a perception check, you succeed. I can move the statue aside and it play the Zelda sound effect. And they've discovered an empty room. So there's a lot of fun to be had with virtual tabletops if you want to put in the effort, but it's also a lot more prep if you want to put in the effort. Let us wrap it up there. If you want to ask us a question, if you want to engage with us like Bryce did, please leave a comment down below if you're watching this on YouTube, or our Twitter handles are just below our names if you want to keep the conversation going. If you're not watching this on YouTube, you can also email us podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. I have a couple of emails sitting there. We will get around to those, so I apologize if you emailed me in December and we haven't read them out yet. We will jump onto those. And possibly, as James said, I think last week or a couple of weeks ago, possibly do a whole episode where we're just answering emails, because some of the questions that have been coming in have been great. So please do send those through if you have any. Like I said, you can comment below or email podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. I've been Ben Byrne here with Dale Kingsmill, Sean Merwin, Logan Reese. Hope to see you all next week. Until then, goodbye.